Story 1. This is an old story from when I was back in secondary school, high school, taking place during year 10, 14, 15 years old, while taking my GCSE, General Certificate of Secondary Education, mocks and such. Bit of backstory. During my first few years at secondary school, I'd been the quieter kid, had a few friends, but wasn't patrically heavy built, on the slimer side, and not massively athletic, though had good endurance, coupled to being a bit of a social misfit, but mostly the typical quiet kid who got his work done. I was an easy target for bullies, 2 of which in the same year, and well-known douche canoes by both students and teachers alike. For this story, they'll be known as Bozo and Popeye. These 2 would regularly cause trouble, including smoking underage, disrupting classes, trashing equipment, burning items in science class, that type who couldn't care about anything but themselves. I had to share a Spanish and music class with these 2, and Bozo had taken upon himself to try and wind me up. Over the course of about 4 or 5 months, every chance he got, he'd do stupid stuff like throwing paper balls, rubbish and such at me during class, stuff the pockets on my jacket with junk, steal items from my desk, that petty little stuff that builds up. He'd also shove and push me on a wall or into a door frame given the chance. Anything to get me to lose my cool, so he could try and beat me down as he'd brag and threaten me he would do. What was more annoying was that teachers either didn't have a firm hand or didn't do anything, and this meant Bozo got bolder. He'd go as far as stealing my bag, hiding it or sitting on it claiming he didn't know where it was. So after about 5 months of relentless tormenting, I was hitting my limits. Our family has a tendency to hold back our tempers before something triggers it, and we go off like a hand grenade. In a rage-fueled moment, we'll be calm, then we'll explode. My dad knocked one kid clean out after they kept winding him up, as did my brother after this event. The event? During one music class, Bozo and Popeye were sitting at the back of the class, doing their usual thing, and I had to pop out to go to the toilet. And when I came back, I found my pen was missing. I looked around my desk before I heard a snigger, "Lost something." Bozo was sitting there with my pen, a fountain pen with my name engraved. I still have it today. I ask for it back, and he offers it up, and then pulls it away before Popeye shoves me back. I turn and call the teacher, whom asks Bozo to give it back. He refuses, to which she turns and says, "You'll have to get it back after class. Now sit down as we need to continue." Bozo's sitting there with my pen, not using it, but instead starts chewing on it. My brain finally snapped, and my rational thinking went out the window, replaced by a primal urge to screw this arrogant guy up as much as I could. The red mist descended, and next thing I know, I'm being pulled off of him by 3 other students, and the teacher was mouth agape at the scene. Apparently I'd completely lost my cool, vaulted up onto my desk, jumping from desk to Bozo and Popeye's desk, dove on Bozo, knocking him backwards off his seat and coming crashing down on his chest, to which I sat on his stomach, to which I had then gone to town beating his chest, face and such. Bozo dropped the pen, and I grabbed it back in the heat of the moment. We both got pulled up to the head teacher's office for the incident. I was pretty upset about it, but Bozo was already under caution for other incidents. The end result was he got a week's suspension from school. I was warned about my behavior, but otherwise was let off the hook. I later heard he'd suffered bruised ribs, a damaged kidney, and several heavy bruises all over his chest, which took a few weeks to heal. The aftermath of this event was as follows. The last 18 months of my secondary school were pretty good. People treated me better, and I didn't get anything like as much grief. Bozo and Popeye soon vanished, as I didn't see them in class. I guess they got moved into another school or class, as no one saw them on campus again. The kicker was when we were presented our awards at the end of the year. Record of Achievement binder for those in the UK. Remember those? I was the only person in the entire year to get their name chanted by the entire school year. Turns out word got round that Bozo had been finally put in his place by the last person anyone would have thought to do it. I don't know what happened to those 2, but knowing their personalities, I can't see them changing their behavior, and likely ended up in some dead-end job. I've never bothered to check on social media, not inclined to bother. Story 2. Hi everyone. The entitled parent in this story was actually my then wife, and this incident was one of the factors that ultimately led to our divorce. To give you some background, my wife, let's call her Emily, had always had a bit of an entitled side, largely because she grew up with wealthy parents. She was one of those, keep me in the lifestyle I'm accustomed to types. I accepted that about her, understanding it was mostly due to her upbringing, and I thought maybe real-world experiences would help her unlearn some of those behaviors. Emily did have a wonderful side to her too. She could be generous, loving, and genuinely cared about the people she let into her life. But I think her entitlement also fed into her approach as a parent. She expected others to be as generous as she could be, and she was fiercely protective of our children, often to the point of being unable to see any faults in them, at least not until I pointed them out, usually in painstaking detail. This led to a bit of a disconnect between how she expected others to act and what was actually reasonable or fair. With that in mind, here's what happened. We were at a large grocery store with our youngest daughter, who has mild autism and struggles with social situations. People with autism often have a distorted sense of self and can seem quite self-centered, as they don't always grasp social boundaries. Our daughter collects these popular vinyl toys and has been especially obsessed with the series featuring characters from a fantasy book series. There was a particular toy she really wanted, and every time we went to this store, she would head straight to the toy aisle to see if they had it. We could have ordered it online, but we'd promised she could get it if it was in stock, and that small hope made transitions, like getting her out of the house, much easier. She struggles with transitions, so this setup helped us manage the stress. On this particular day, we arrived at the store, and as usual, she went straight for the toy aisle. Emily and I followed behind to give her some space to browse. She was out of sight for no more than a minute when we suddenly heard her scream. We both ran over, panicking, and found our daughter trying to take the toy out of another young girl's hands. This other girl was in a wheelchair and clearly had significant learning difficulties. Before anyone judges my daughter, please remember she has autism and some associated learning disabilities. The girl in the wheelchair was holding the toy just out of reach, while her mother stood nearby, trying to shield her daughter from ours without actually touching her, which was not an easy task. Emily immediately stomped over and, without assessing the situation, snapped at the other mother. "Don't you dare touch my daughter." The other mother, with an incredible amount of patience, responded calmly, saying, I'm trying to stop her from hurting my daughter." I felt a bit annoyed at this assumption since our daughter has never been violent, but I could see why she would worry, given the situation. Emily, on the other hand, did not. She instantly began shouting, "How dare you? Do you think she's some kind of monster? She would never harm a child with learning difficulties. She just wants the toy, and if you'd give it to her, she'd leave you alone." Emily then turned to the girl and demanded, "Give it to her now." At that moment, the other mother stepped closer to Emily, calmly but firmly warning her not to speak about her daughter that way again, or there would be consequences. Emily looked to me for support, but I simply looked back at her, silent. I was on the verge of intervening, but in favor of the other mother. I was so upset that Emily would speak about a child like that, especially given our own daughter's challenges and how hurt she has felt in the past when others have labeled her unfairly. Right then, I felt a wave of realization. The woman I had married was not the person I had thought she was. They argued for a while with no real progress, Emily insisting our daughter needed the toy due to her autism, and the other mother calmly explaining that her daughter had found it first and didn't need to give it up. We later discovered there were several more of these toys on the shelf. By that point, I was completely fed up. I stepped in, cutting Emily off, and apologized sincerely to the other mother. I even offered to buy her daughter the toy, but she declined, understandably still upset. As she walked away, Emily turned on me, furious that I hadn't defended her. I told her firmly that I would discuss it with her once we were in the car. Meanwhile, I led our daughter to pick another one of the toys from the shelf. Emily continued following me around the store, trying to engage me in conversation, but I ignored her and reminded her I would only speak to her once we were in private. I had never felt so disappointed in anyone, and the thought that she was the mother of my child made me feel physically sick. Later, I tried to explain to her why she was wrong, and she began to see it. But for me, the damage was already done. I realized I couldn't be with someone who would use language like that toward another child, especially one facing even greater challenges than our daughter. We ended up divorcing over something else a few weeks later, but in the back of my mind, this incident was really the beginning of the end. I know this doesn't have a climactic ending, but I thought you all might find it interesting enough. Story 3. I've been working at my current company for about 3 years now as a project coordinator. Fresh out of college, I started at entry level and worked my way up through consistent dedication and overtime. The company has this performance-based bonus system that evaluates everyone individually based on their project completion rates, client satisfaction, and overall contribution to the team. It's pretty straightforward. You work hard, you get rewarded. This quarter, I absolutely crushed it. I managed to complete 3 major projects ahead of schedule, earned perfect client satisfaction scores, and even trained 2 new team members during my lunch breaks. I was practically living at the office, working late into the night, and sacrificing my weekends to ensure everything was perfect. When bonus time came around, I received a substantial reward for my efforts. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to make all those late nights worth it. That's when the drama started. My coworker, let's call her Karen, approached me in the break room the day after the bonus announcements. She asked if I had a minute to talk. When I agreed, she offered what seemed like a congratulations about my bonus, but I could tell something was off about her tone. Before I could even properly thank her, she dropped the bomb. She thought we should split the bonus. I nearly choked on my coffee when she said it. When I asked her to clarify, thinking I must have misheard, she launched into an explanation about how everyone works hard and that she actually deserved it more than me because she has 2 kids and a mortgage to pay. I tried to explain how the bonus system works, emphasizing that it's based on individual performance. She immediately dismissed my explanation, pointing out that I'm single and live in a tiny apartment. She questioned what I would even need the money for, insisting that she had real expenses. When I maintained that my personal life wasn't relevant and that I earned the bonus through my work performance, she called me selfish and made a comment about how we're supposed to be a team. Then she stormed off before I could respond. Over the next few days, I noticed she'd been talking to other coworkers. Some of them started giving me the cold shoulder or making snippy comments about privilege and unfairness. Things came to a head during our weekly team meeting. Karen decided to make it a public issue. Before anyone could start the meeting, she announced that we needed to address what she called the toxic individualistic culture in the office, claiming that some people were hoarding bonuses while others struggled to make ends meet. When our supervisor asked for clarification, Karen pointed directly at me and accused me of refusing to share my bonus, claiming it was creating a hostile work environment. I tried to defend myself by explaining my extra hours and weekend work, but she interrupted me, twisting my words to suggest I was saying others didn't work hard. That's when our supervisor pulled out a folder and turned the tables. He revealed Karen's actual performance metrics for the quarter. She was late on 60% of her deadlines, took extended breaks averaging 90 minutes daily, had 2 client complaints about delayed responses, and spent an average of 3 hours daily on non-work-related websites. The room went completely silent. Our supervisor then informed Karen that discussing other employees' compensation was against company policy and issued her an official warning. He made it clear that if she continued to harass coworkers about their bonuses or create a hostile work environment, there would be disciplinary action. Karen's face turned bright red, and she left the meeting immediately. The next day, she submitted her 2 weeks' notice, claiming in her resignation that the company promotes toxic individualism. Most of my coworkers came to apologize for buying into her drama, and things have mostly returned to normal. The best part? Her position was filled by one of the new team members I trained, who's already showing more productivity in their first week than Karen did in her last month. Story 4. After my divorce last year, I decided to downsize from our suburban house to a cozy townhouse closer to the city. The place isn't huge, but it's perfect for me and my golden retriever. One of the main selling points was actually the private driveway, a rare find in this neighborhood where most residents have to rely on street parking. Everything was peaceful for the first few months until my next-door neighbor started getting creative with parking arrangements. It began innocently enough. One evening, she knocked on my door looking distressed. She explained that she was having friends over for a dinner party and asked if one of her guests could use my driveway for a few hours since the street parking was full. I hesitantly agreed, thinking it would be just this one time. That was my first mistake, giving an inch, because soon enough, that inch turned into a mile. A week later, I came home to find her car in my driveway. When I went to talk to her about it, she casually dismissed my concerns, saying she knew I wouldn't mind because of the next morning's street cleaning, promising to move it first thing. This pattern kept repeating. Every time I confronted her, she had a different excuse. She'd mention the heavy rain, or having groceries to unload, or the crowded street during game days. Each time, she acted like she was doing me a favor by putting my empty driveway to good use. I tried being nice. I tried being firm. I even offered to help her find alternative parking solutions. Nothing worked. Then came the morning that broke the camel's back. I had an important client presentation at 9 a.m. I walked out at 8:15, plenty of time to get to the office, only to find her car blocking mine in the driveway. I knocked on her door. No answer. Called her number, which I had from previous parking incidents. Straight to voicemail. After 15 minutes of trying to reach her, she finally sauntered out of her house. When I told her I needed to leave for work, she dismissed my concerns as dramatic, claiming she was just about to move it. She then had the audacity to lecture me about being unneighborly and selfish for not sharing my driveway. When I reminded her it was my property and that I'd repeatedly asked her not to park there, she mockingly dismissed my concerns about property rights and boundaries, insisting she had just as much right to park there as I did. I was late for my presentation. I stumbled through it, got some concerned looks from my boss, and spent the rest of the day seething. That evening, I called a towing company and arranged to have them on speed dial. Sure enough, 2 days later, I woke up to find her car in my driveway again. This time, I didn't knock. I didn't call. I just contacted the towing service. I was drinking my morning coffee when I heard the tow truck. That's when all hell broke loose. She came running out of her house screaming, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. When I calmly reminded her about my previous warnings, she completely lost it. She charged at me, swinging her purse like a weapon. I managed to step back, but she was absolutely unhinged, screaming that she would make my life hell. What she didn't know was that I'd installed security cameras after the third unauthorized parking incident. Everything, the assault attempt, the threats, her previous unauthorized parking, was all caught on camera. I called the police right there, showed them the footage, and filed a report. Turns out, she had several complaints against her from other neighbors, 2 noise violations, harassment, the works. The responding officer was clearly unimpressed with her behavior, informing her that she was being charged with attempted assault and making threats, along with noting the pattern of unauthorized use of private property. She tried to defend herself by downplaying it as just a parking spot, but her protests fell on deaf ears. She was arrested right there in front of the growing crowd of neighbors who'd come out to watch the drama. Some of them actually thanked me afterward, saying they'd been dealing with her entitled behavior for years, but were too intimidated to do anything. Now she's facing charges, and I heard through the grapevine that her landlord is not renewing her lease. The street's been wonderfully peaceful lately, and my driveway has remained blissfully empty when I'm not using it. Sometimes I feel a tiny bit guilty about how it all ended, but then I remember all those months of stress and that disastrous presentation morning, and the guilt magically disappears. My driveway, my rules. Story 5. I'm 38 years old now, and much more mature and sure of myself, But back in school, I was the typical bullied nerd. Teachers loved me, kids picked on me, threw me in lockers. You know the drill, most of you have gone through it. There was this particular kid at my high school that took specific pleasure in making my days hell. Most of my childhood is a blurry mess, but I will forever remember his name, his face, and the moment I took revenge. Let's call him John for the purpose of this post. So John and his friends, throughout most of the year, took a lot of pleasure in teasing me, throwing my books on the ground, scaring me, and sometimes actually became physical and pushed me to the ground. Being a scrawny teenager and no one to teach me to defend myself, I sort of had to take it and shut up, because I knew from experience I couldn't deal with it without suffering some very bad consequences at home or at school. Except this one time. The school was in front of a community center, with both main entrances separated by a dead-end street that was only used by buses and school staff, so no traffic was ever present. Coming back from lunch at home since I lived close by, I'm walking towards the school entrance, trying to keep my head down and not making eye contact with anyone, as usual. But out of the corner of my eyes, I can see John and his group of friends loitering next to the front door of the community center, looking towards me, snickering, laughing, and most probably planning something. Then John looks at his buddies and starts sprinting at me, full speed, from across the street. And perhaps it's from over 20 years of hindsight that I'm remembering this, but I swear to God it was just like the movies where time slows down. Except John is coming at me from over 100 meters away, clearly and undeniably coming at me to push me on the asphalted ground in front of the school. As he approached, my brain decided that for once, instead of freezing and blanking, would throw a great idea at me, that this time I would do something about it and not let myself get hurt. Thanks, brain, for not failing me in that last year of high school. John is coming at me, still at full speed, arms extended, that smug grin on his face, knowing full well he was going to be hurting me. Inches away, my body enacts the plan that formed in my head in mere seconds, driven by a mix of pure fight response and adrenaline. I took one step towards my right, but my left foot stayed exactly where it was. And wouldn't you know it, John the bully didn't have any time to react. He was already leaning forward and had no chance of stopping his momentum, or to prevent his legs from hitting mine, and so they did. And John face planted directly on the pavement. I heard the sound of his body hitting the ground. I heard enough scraping to know that he slid at least a few inches. But I didn't look. Cool people don't look at explosions, and neither did I. And boy did he explode. I heard a sound of rage behind me as John got up, brushed himself once, and came right back at me from behind to push me again. To this day, I have no idea what WIC-level reflexes made me do this, but I sidestepped again towards my left, and again my other foot remained right where it was. And again, John could not stop his momentum, could not avoid going forward, could not avoid his legs hitting mine. John face planted, again, right in front of me. I continue walking, swerving around his face-down body, quickly continuing my motion towards the school's entrance, which was, thankfully, only a couple of seconds away at this point. I entered the school and went about my day. I'll be honest, I don't remember the rest of the day because it just merges into the rest of the blur that is my childhood. The moment of adrenaline is gone, my memory becomes fuzzy again. But let me tell you what I do remember. John stopped trying to push me. He avoided me, mostly, for the end of the year. I can't be sure the bullying completely subsided, but I know the end of my high school years were at least marginally better. But I do know John left me alone. Sadly, it took me years to get over the bullying from high school and decades to be able to stand up to people. I finally realized I could recently. It gets better, my friends. It really does. Story 6. So this story happened back in 2009, when I was starting my sophomore year, 10th grade for anyone unfamiliar with the term. It's more my parents' revenge, and I have their permission to post it here. I'm reminded of it now because I was on a date recently, and she asked me why I only had one hand on the steering wheel while we were driving to our destination. The answer to that is simple. I grew up on a farm, and the first vehicle I learned to drive was my dad's tractor when I was 9. Yes, farm kids learn to drive very early on in life, especially if they're fast-growing bean sprouts like me. Like many vehicles, tractors have the pedals for clutch, brake, and gas, and the steering wheel. In addition to those, you have the implement controls for the tools the tractor is pulling alongside the gear shift and engine speed. These are typically on the right-hand side and usually require you to keep one hand on them, with the other hand on the wheel. These days I drive an automatic transmission vehicle, but having driven tractors and large manual transmission trucks through the fields for so many years, as a kid left me with the habit of resting my right arm on the center console, since there's nothing I need to do with it except maybe hold hands with my dates. This is something my dad does all the time when he and my mom are in the car together, either on their own or with me and my siblings in tow. And no, for anyone who is wondering, my phone stays in my pocket until I've reached my destination. Answering a text while driving is not worth mine or anyone else's safety. So back to the story. Entering sophomore year, I was now old enough according to my state's laws that I could take a driver's education course, something my high school offered as an extracurricular class. I aced that class in every respect, until it came time to get in the car with the instructor. The driving portion of the class had 2 sessions each, one in the morning before school started, and one in the afternoon after school let out, with extra sessions on Saturdays to handle all the prospective drivers in the class. We were sorted alphabetically, so our instructor, Mrs. Tyrant, had an easier time keeping track of us. She was a thin woman with a constant scowl and despised pointless questions. I got a ride with a friend the Saturday morning it was his and my turn on the list, alongside one other student. It was the weekend before Thanksgiving and getting close to winter, but it hadn't snowed yet and was therefore bone cold outside. Mrs. Tyrant was waiting inside the exam car with the engine running. The other student got out of her mom's truck once she saw us, and her mom and my friend's dad both drove away once we were in the exam car. I was going to be the first to drive that morning, with my friend and the other student in the back seat waiting for their turns. We went through the checklist of pre-driving safety checks, and then we were on our way. I put the car in gear, rested my arm on the center console since it was an automatic, and there was nothing I needed to use it for, I thought, and pressed the gas. Nothing. Both hands on the wheel, Mrs. Tyrant sternly said with her foot on the examiner's brake. I apologized and put my right hand on the wheel, and it was so weird, especially since I was accustomed to not doing that. As such, my right hand slackened and dropped to the center console again before we even left the parking lot. Cue the brake. Both hands on the wheel, Mrs. Tyrant repeated. I tried to explain why it felt weird, but she wouldn't let me get a word in. If you're not going to keep both hands on the wheel, you can use your little phone to call for a ride home. I don't have a phone, I protested. Really, at this point in time, I didn't have a cell phone, and I'm ultimately grateful to my parents for refusing to buy me one. But this was another point in my teenage years where I wished they would have bought me one. Don't be ridiculous, you kids all have phones, Mrs. Tyrant said as she put the car in park and gestured for me to get out. I complied and tried to get in the back seat while my friend got into the driver's seat. I said, "Call for a ride home." Mrs. Tyrant repeated. My friend tried to talk her out of leaving me there, only for her to threaten him with a failed test. We all know what teenagers can be like, and he chose the driving test over his friend. He and I still talk and play games together from time to time, but he does regret leaving me behind. So I was left there, in the school parking lot, on a Saturday morning, in the freezing cold, my only shelter being the school's entryway. Thankfully, I wasn't out there for long, maybe about 20 minutes, when some dude I hadn't met before kept honking until I noticed him. My parents later scolded me for trusting a stranger, and I don't blame them. But at the time, I was too cold to care, and his car was warm. Turned out he was the girl's older brother. He had graduated 6 years earlier and was visiting his parents for Thanksgiving that coming week. His sister, the other student, had frantically texted her family since she did have a phone to tell them that I needed help, and he came over to the school straight away to take me back to my house. Mom was furious after I told her what had happened when I got home and called my dad, who was out in the fields, who was equally furious at the news. Despite their immediate efforts, Mrs. Tyrant and the school suffered no consequences, since there weren't any security cameras around the school at the time. Meanwhile, I not only ended up with a nasty cold that lasted until after Thanksgiving Day, but also got flunked out of the driver's education course and wouldn't be allowed to take the course again that year. Fast forward to May, the sun was out and shining and the end of the school year had arrived. The only bad note on my report card was the driver's education course, which had done just enough damage to take me off the potential valedictorian lineup for my graduating class. As usual for summer, my dad needed help out in the fields, but instead hired a few neighbors so I could take a summer driver's education course that he paid for, so I could be more useful around the place, he joked. But I knew it was because of Mrs. Tyrant failing me before I even had a chance, and that I had otherwise earned the privilege with my good grades. Each day he or Mom would take the time each day to deliver me to and pick me up from the course in the nearest city about half an hour away. The instructor for this course, Mr. Saint, was a big man with a bellowing laugh, and he took the time to listen to his students' concerns. Eventually it came time for me to get behind the wheel again. When I told my dad on our way there, he got all thoughtful for a good minute. "Son, I want you to briefly explain to Mr. Saint, before you even get in the car with him, that you've been driving tractors for several years now, as well as how the controls for one are laid out if he isn't familiar with them," he says to me. I didn't really get it at the time, but I agreed to do just that. And just that I did when Mr. Saint invited me to climb into the driver's seat for my driving exam. He was familiar with the typical layout of tractor controls, so I didn't have to explain it to him. He kept a very careful eye on me and everything I did during the driving exam. And unlike Mrs. Tyrant, he didn't touch his brake once. "Just like any farming kid I've had in my courses, your driving is top-notch," Mr. Saint says to me. "But why did you feel the need to let me know ahead of time?" "My dad told me to," I said, pointing to my dad who was waiting in his truck. "Mind if I speak with him?" Mr. Saint asked. "I don't mind, sir, but he's going to want to leave soon so we can get back to work." "I'll be sure to make it quick," Mr. Saint said as he went over to my dad's truck. They talked for a couple of minutes, Mr. Saint making notes on his clipboard, before Dad waved me over when they were done talking. "What did Mr. Saint want to talk with you about, Dad?" I asked as I climbed in. "Oh, nothing much," Dad replied with a grin as he began to drive away. I tried to get him to tell me what they had talked about, but he remained adamantly silent about the matter. A few weeks later I had my learner's permit and was quickly racking up the hours I needed for my license. The school year started about a month later, and I was asked by a few friends if I would be redoing driver's ed. I told them no, I had taken a summer course since my dad needed my help sooner rather than later, and I already had my learner's permit. That's when I found out that Mrs. Tyrant had been fired just the week before, and that Mr. Saint would be teaching the course in her place until the school board decided whether they would keep the course or drop it altogether. During my lunch break that first day, rather than eat with my friends, I went to the classroom where Mr. Saint was going to be teaching that afternoon and found him sitting behind what used to be Mrs. Tyrant's desk. After a bit of stuttering on my part, I asked him what had happened, and he said he had been recommended by my dad as a replacement when Mrs. Tyrant's teacher's license was revoked, and she was subsequently fired. Also, Mr. Saint told me that my dad had stayed in contact with him after their little chat, and that he had been told of Mrs. Tyrant's treatment of me and possibly other students. Mr. Saint then passed that info along with his records on to the county, who pulled Mrs. Tyrant into a performance review. And yep, I wasn't the only one she had flunked over the years for what was perceived as one of many minor errors in this farmland-rich area. That alone was enough to make sure she could never renew her license ever again. What, or rather who, got it revoked were my parents, who finally had people listening to them about how Mrs. Tyrant had neglected her duty as a guardian to her students by leaving them stranded in front of the school until they were picked up, and I was the final straw. The school board also invested in a security system at this time, so they had video footage for incidents like this that popped up in the future. Furthermore, my driver's education grade was purged from the system, along with anyone else currently in the school who had taken the class under Mrs. Tyrant, both good and bad. This put me back in the potential valedictorian lineup for my class, much to my parents' delight.